America's prisons hide a secret on every tray. From Alcatraz's legendary best meals in the federal system, to the tasteless, calorie-counted portions of ADX Florence, prison food tells the story of control, punishment, and survival. What happened between the golden era of Alcatraz dining halls and the gray isolation of supermaxes? Let's uncover the shocking truth behind how America's prison meals went from steak and coffee to soy paste and powdered milk. Before we dive in, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. This is From Alcatraz to ADX, the disgusting evolution of prison food in the U.S. When Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary opened its iron gates in 1934, it wasn't just known for its escape-proof design. It was famous for something completely unexpected: its food. While other prisons across the country served cold beans, mystery meat, and bread that could double as a weapon, Alcatraz boasted what newspapers of the time called the best meals in the federal system. It sounds impossible that the island prison housing America's most dangerous men could have better dining than some soldiers during World War II, but the evidence is real, written in government reports, inmate letters, and even FBI archives. Warden James A. Johnston believed that a well-fed prisoner is a calm prisoner. His philosophy was simple: give inmates decent meals and they'll cause less trouble. Every day, men like Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, and Alvin Karpis lined up in a spotless dining hall overlooking the San Francisco Bay, with meals prepared by trained prison cooks and monitored like a military operation. The kitchen was so organized that even utensils were numbered to prevent escapes or attacks. If a knife went missing, the entire prison went on lockdown. Breakfast might include scrambled eggs, toast with butter, oatmeal, and real coffee. Lunch could be soup, roast beef, mashed potatoes, and fresh bread baked daily in the prison's own bakery. Dinner often featured meatloaf, vegetables, and dessert, sometimes pudding, sometimes fruit. Inmates could even go back for seconds as long as they didn't waste food. Former inmate Alvin Karpis, the notorious bank robber from the Public Enemy era, once wrote that Alcatraz food was the best in the federal system. You couldn't beat it. But behind that reputation was something deeper: a strategy of control through satisfaction. Johnston knew that a man plotting escape or rebellion on a full stomach was far less dangerous than one starving and angry. So he turned the dining hall into a psychological weapon. The tables were bolted to the floor, guards stood watch on catwalks above, and the menu was designed to provide calm routine. Inmates ate in silence, utensils clinking against metal trays echoing like a metronome of discipline. Still, the food itself became a symbol of pride. For some, it was the only reminder of normal life. The smell of fresh bread or coffee drifting through cell block corridors reminded them that the outside world still existed, even if they would never see it again. However, that balance between nourishment and control would begin to crack as decades passed. By the 1950s, rising costs, overcrowding in other prisons, and the growing tough-on-crime mentality began to reshape how America viewed inmates. The government no longer saw prisoners as men to rehabilitate, but as problems to contain cheaply. When Alcatraz closed in 1963, it marked the end of more than just an era of escapes and legends. It was the end of humane prison meals in the federal system. The next generation of prisons would abandon flavor for function. Meals would be measured in calories, not care. The philosophy of feeding prisoners well to keep peace would give way to feeding them poorly to remind them of punishment. From that moment, America's prison kitchens started their slow descent, from bakeries and fresh produce to microwaved soy protein and powdered mashed potatoes. The transformation would mirror a nation's shifting attitude, from reform to revenge. And as one door closed on the island of Alcatraz, another would open deep in the Colorado mountains, a place so secure, so isolated, that even food became a form of imprisonment itself. When Alcatraz shut down in 1963, the United States lost not only its most famous prison but also a strange kind of order. The well-fed inmate philosophy that once kept tensions low on the Rock was replaced with a new era of mass incarceration, one defined by cost-cutting, punishment, and political performance. By the early 1970s, America's prison system was expanding at an unprecedented rate. Drug laws, racial tensions, and the war on crime filled cells faster than budgets could handle. Feeding thousands of inmates 3 times a day became less about nutrition, and more about survival for the system itself. The goal changed from keep them calm, to keep it cheap. Across the nation, prison menus shrank. Gone were the days of fresh bread and roast beef. Instead, powdered eggs, canned beans, and processed meat substitutes began filling trays. In some state prisons, meals were so monotonous that inmates could predict the weekly cycle. Soy patties Monday, noodles Tuesday, peanut butter sandwiches Wednesday, then back again. It wasn't just bad food, it was deliberately bland. The Bureau of Prisons quietly adopted calorie counting as a form of control. The idea was simple: give inmates the minimum energy required to function, nothing more. Official nutritional charts listed about 2,500 calories per day, but the meals often fell below that, especially in disciplinary units. Inmates who caused trouble might find their portions smaller, colder, or replaced with something much worse, a special diet loaf. This loaf, often called Nutriloaf, would become one of the most infamous punishments in American correctional history. It was a dense, brick-like mix of vegetables, beans, flour, oil, and powdered milk, baked into a single lump meant to be eaten without utensils. Some states added ketchup, others blended the day's leftovers into the recipe. Either way, it was disgusting. Courts would later debate whether Nutriloaf counted as cruel and unusual punishment. Inmates described it as inedible, rubber cement, and a weapon against hunger. Yet it remained legal in dozens of states, justified as nutritionally complete. Prisons like Attica, Leavenworth, and San Quentin began to symbolize this harsh new era. At Attica, where a 1971 uprising left 43 dead, survivors recalled that food grievances were one of the sparks. Meals were cold, meat was spoiled, and water was often rationed. The riot wasn't just about politics, it was about human dignity served on a dented metal tray. The federal government took notice. But instead of reforming the food, it restructured the system. Centralized food contracts and industrial suppliers replaced on-site kitchens. Private companies began delivering prepackaged correctional meals, often designed for shelf life rather than taste. Everything could be measured, down to the penny, down to the calorie. By the late 1980s, America's "get tough on crime" policies meant more inmates and fewer resources. Food budgets were slashed. At some facilities, meals cost less than $2 per inmate per day. Reports from the time revealed horrifying details. Maggots found in food at Michigan prisons, milk diluted with water in Texas, and expired rations reused at Rikers Island in New York. Even prison staff started complaining. In one 1990 report from Illinois, a warden admitted that the food is so poor, it creates more fights than it prevents. Guards would smuggle salt packets and condiments to inmates to keep peace. Nutrition experts also raised alarms. Studies in the 1990s showed that many inmates suffered from vitamin deficiencies, rapid weight loss, and gastrointestinal problems due to the processed nature of prison food. Fresh fruit became a luxury. Vegetables were canned and boiled until flavorless. And sugar, one of the few pleasures inmates could buy from commissary, became its own underground economy. The system had found a new way to punish without violence, through hunger and monotony. A man's spirit could be broken not just by isolation, but by years of tasteless, colorless, identical meals. The philosophy once rooted in control through satisfaction had mutated into control through deprivation. Every calorie was counted, every ingredient weighed, every crumb accounted for. The prison meal had evolved into a tool, part nutrition, part punishment, and part psychological warfare. As America entered the 1990s, a new symbol of this evolution was rising from the Colorado desert. A fortress so extreme, even the food reflected its mission: total control. This was ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, and its menu would become a case study in how far America had fallen from the days of steak and coffee on the rock. High in the desert plains of Colorado, surrounded by mountains and silence, stands a fortress designed to break the human spirit without ever laying a hand on it: ADX Florence, America's most secure prison. Officially called the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, or simply Supermax, it opened in 1994 as the ultimate answer to violence and chaos inside the federal system. But what most people don't realize is that the control doesn't end at the cell door. It extends to every detail of life, including what inmates eat, how they eat it, and when. Every meal in ADX Florence is delivered through a narrow slot in a solid steel door. Inmates never sit in a dining hall. They never eat beside another person. There's no chatter, no noise of clinking trays, just the metallic scrape of a food cart in the hallway, 3 times a day, followed by the soft thud of a tray sliding in. Each inmate has to eat within his cell, surrounded by concrete walls, a metal sink, and a fixed stool bolted to the floor. The smell of reheated food lingers for hours in the stale air. According to reports from the Marshall Project, the Denver Post, and former staff, meals inside ADX are portion-controlled and nutritionally balanced, at least on paper. Each tray is calculated to provide about 2,700 calories a day, enough to sustain life but rarely enough to satisfy hunger. The food is often cold by the time it reaches the inmate and entirely unseasoned. Former ADX guard Robert Hood, who served as warden from 2002 to 2005, once described the system bluntly. Everything is designed for control. Even the food is a tool of behavior management. Breakfast might be instant oatmeal, powdered milk, and a slice of bread. Lunch could be soy patties, beans, and plain rice. Dinner often repeats the pattern, a mixture of starches and protein substitutes served without spice, color, or variety. Meat is rare, and when it appears it's often processed, a grayish chicken patty or ground beef cooked to dryness. For inmates in disciplinary segregation, known as the control unit, the meals can be even worse. Violations can result in Nutriloaf punishment, the same dense, brick-like food lump once used in state prisons. It contains all food groups but tastes like wet cardboard. Inmates have described it as eating a wall. Even small comforts are regulated. Salt, pepper, and condiments are banned. Fresh fruit is almost non-existent. Vegetables are often canned or dehydrated. Dessert, when offered, might be a small cookie or gelatin cup, though most inmates report they rarely see one. A former ADX staffer once told the New York Times, "You can tell how an inmate's behavior has been by looking at their tray. Good behavior gets a little better meal. Bad behavior, you're back to the basics." It's not just the food, it's the experience of eating alone for years, sometimes decades. Men like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, Ramzi Youssef, the 1993 World Trade Center bomber, and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman have all eaten behind those same steel doors in total isolation. Every bite is a reminder that this place isn't meant to reform, it's meant to contain. There are no kitchen smells wafting down corridors, no clatter of utensils. The act of eating becomes mechanical, an obligation, not a moment of relief. Some inmates reportedly talk to themselves or recite prayers before meals, just to hear a voice in the silence. Others save bread or cookies, hiding them as small rewards to mark time passing. In 2015, human rights advocates from Amnesty International visited Florence and described the meals as functional but dehumanizing. They weren't spoiled or unsafe, but they were engineered for obedience. The taste, temperature, and texture all reminded inmates that comfort was a privilege, not a right. Even in medical units, where inmates suffering from diabetes or other conditions need special diets, complaints are common. Many report getting one-size-fits-all trays regardless of health needs, resulting in rapid weight loss, fatigue, or worsening illness. Yet, the Bureau of Prisons maintains that ADX provides meals that meet federal nutritional guidelines, a claim technically true, but emotionally hollow. In practice, those calories are stripped of dignity. One inmate, writing anonymously to a prison reform group, summarized it like this: "They don't feed you to live. They feed you so you don't die." The contrast to Alcatraz couldn't be starker. Where The Rock once used food to calm men, ADX uses it to remind them they have no power at all. The tray isn't just a meal, it's a message: we control what you eat, when you eat, and how much of it you get. And while ADX became the face of modern supermax isolation, the philosophy behind its food, punishment disguised as nutrition, began spreading across America's correctional landscape. From county jails to state penitentiaries, the ADX diet became the silent standard of mass incarceration. But as stories leaked out from behind those walls, another truth emerged: that neglecting food wasn't just cruelty, it was costly. Malnutrition led to violence, sickness, and lawsuits. And in the 2000s, that pressure began to expose scandals that would shake the entire prison food supply chain. By the dawn of the 2000s, America's prison population had exploded to over 2 million people, the largest incarcerated population on Earth. Feeding that many inmates was no longer a correctional duty, it was a corporate opportunity. What once was a public service run by government kitchens transformed into a billion-dollar business dominated by private contractors. And with profit as the driving force, every meal served behind bars became part of an equation: how to feed a human being for the lowest cost possible. At the heart of this transformation stood companies like Aramark Correctional Services, Trinity Services Group, and Keefe Group. These corporations won lucrative contracts with states promising to handle everything, from sourcing ingredients to running prison kitchens, all while saving taxpayers millions. On paper it looked efficient. In practice, it became a perfect storm of neglect, greed, and suffering. Reports from the Marshall Project, Reuters, and the Associated Press reveal a grim pattern. Once a private contractor took over a state's prison food system, complaints surged almost immediately. Meals grew smaller. Ingredients got cheaper. Spoiled or contaminated food became common. Why? Because every cent saved on a single tray multiplied across tens of thousands of inmates meant more profit. In Michigan, a 2014 investigation uncovered that Aramark employees had served food contaminated with maggots in multiple prisons. Inmates reported being forced to eat spoiled meat and moldy bread. When the scandal broke, the state fined the company over $200,000, but the contract continued. Later reports revealed kitchen staff shortages, falsified meal logs, and employees caught smuggling contraband in exchange for favors. The same year in Ohio, prisoners documented trays filled with rotten vegetables, undercooked chicken, and foul-smelling beans. Some inmates fell ill, others refused to eat altogether, sparking hunger strikes that spread through multiple facilities. In Florida, Trinity Services Group, another major contractor, was accused of cutting portion sizes below contract requirements to save money. An internal audit revealed that prisoners were often served less than half the required calories, especially on weekends when oversight was minimal. And these weren't isolated cases. Across the country from Pennsylvania to Arizona, lawsuits piled up. The stories were nearly identical. Food infested with insects. Milk past its expiration date by weeks. Bread so hard it could crack teeth. Stew made from leftover meat reboiled day after day. Still, companies defended themselves using legal loopholes. Their contracts often specified calorie counts, not ingredient quality. So, as long as the numbers looked right on paper, 2,500 calories, 3 meals, minimal cost, the system was considered compliant. This race to the bottom created a hidden hierarchy of hunger. Inmates who could afford commissary items, instant noodles, chips, or canned tuna, survived. Those who couldn't were left to depend on whatever the kitchen served, leading to malnutrition and health problems. Many inmates began trading food for hygiene items or favors, turning meals into currency. Nutritionists who reviewed prison menus from this era described them as barely meeting survival standards. Diets were high in sodium and starch, low in vitamins and protein. Fruit was a rarity, fresh vegetables were almost non-existent. Even milk was often powdered. Meanwhile, the profit margins were stunning. In some contracts, companies earned millions in management fees while spending less than $1.20 per inmate per day on actual food. For context, that's less than the cost of a small bottle of water in most stores. In 2017, The Guardian published a striking comparison. An average U.S. school spends $3.81 per child per lunch. A prison contractor spends less than half that to feed an adult inmate 3 times a day. It wasn't just a question of money, it was a question of morality. When profit replaces care in the most basic human need, food stops being nourishment and becomes a weapon. Even correctional officers began to turn against the system. In several states, guards privately admitted they wouldn't eat what they served inmates. Some brought their own meals to avoid sickness. "You wouldn't give that slop to a dog," one officer in Georgia confessed to reporters. The neglect had consequences. Riots, hunger strikes, and lawsuits surged nationwide. Inmates at Rikers Island protested the maggot-infested meals. Prisoners in Alabama filed federal lawsuits alleging starvation. One warden in Mississippi admitted publicly that poor food quality was one of the top causes of prison unrest. The government's response was slow. Instead of reform, oversight was outsourced too. Audits were done by the same companies under scrutiny. Complaints vanished in paperwork. But by the 2010s, social media and investigative journalism began tearing down those walls. Photos leaked from inside prison kitchens. Trays with mold, cockroaches crawling over bread, slop that looked like gray paste. Public outrage grew. Yet for the people eating it, nothing changed. Behind closed doors, America's prison meal had become an industry, not a service. Every tray represented a balance sheet entry. Every dollar saved came from the belly of someone society chose not to see. And at the end of that chain, the very place designed to represent America's modern correctional perfection, ADX Florence, still served food that looked and tasted no better than what those contractors produced. Because the truth was simple: when food becomes punishment, no amount of security can hide the cruelty it represents. But there was one more twist to this story: how inmates began to fight back, not with weapons or riots, but with the one thing the system couldn't fully control: their creativity and resilience. When the trays became unbearable and the kitchen turned into a symbol of cruelty, inmates did what humans have always done under pressure: they adapted. Inside the concrete walls of America's toughest prisons, a hidden culture of creativity, resilience, and rebellion was born, one meal at a time. The official prison meals might have been cold, flavorless, or downright revolting, but behind locked cell doors and under flickering lights, inmates created something else, their own underground cuisine. Using nothing more than commissary snacks, smuggled seasoning, and a little ingenuity, they built a new kind of food system, one not based on control but on survival and dignity. It started small. Inmates with money could buy items from the commissary: instant ramen noodles, chips, canned tuna, peanut butter, and instant coffee. These basic products became the foundation of prison cooking. Using improvised tools like hot plates, stingers, makeshift water heaters made from wires, or even steam vents, inmates turned processed scraps into something that tasted like home. A former inmate at San Quentin once told Vice News, "We couldn't change the walls, but we could change what went in our mouths. That was our freedom." Inside ADX Florence, even under its extreme restrictions, some inmates found ways to modify their meals. They would mix soy patties with crushed crackers for texture, add sugar packets to bland oatmeal, or save bread slices to toast them against the hot metal surface of their cell lights. It wasn't much, but it was control, and control was everything. In less secure prisons, the practice went far beyond survival. Entire cell block economies revolved around food. Commissary cooks became legends, trading dishes for favors, protection, or information. Some prisons even had informal restaurants, setups where one inmate cooked for others in exchange for toiletries or stamps. The most famous dish of all was the spread. A spread wasn't just food, it was an act of unity. Inmates would pool their commissary items, often for a birthday, a holiday, or just a rare good day. They'd mix ramen noodles, chips, cheese sauce, tuna, or summer sausage in plastic bags, then seal them tight and let the heat cook it through. The result was a salty, spicy, surprisingly satisfying meal, a far cry from the tasteless trays handed out by the system. In maximum security prisons like Pelican Bay or Angola, these spreads became events, moments of humanity. One former inmate described it perfectly. "You could be serving life, but when we make a spread for those few minutes, it feels like family." Even in ADX Florence, where communication between inmates is nearly impossible, prisoners found small ways to share food through fishing, sliding small packets or wrapped snacks under cell doors tied to makeshift ropes of torn fabric. It was risky and forbidden, but it reminded them they weren't alone. Some inmates became so skilled that they were called iron chefs of the cell block. They made tamales from corn chips and hot water, cheesecakes from powdered milk and cookies, burritos from ramen and canned chili. These dishes were more than meals, they were acts of rebellion. They said, "You can lock me up, but you can't take away my will to live like a human being." Even creativity had its price. Commissary food was expensive compared to what inmates earned. Some made as little as 10 to 30 cents an hour. A single pack of ramen could cost the equivalent of an entire day's labor. Yet inmates still found ways. They traded art, handmade cards, or chores for ingredients. Food became currency, and sometimes, a lifeline. But for all the cleverness, these makeshift kitchens couldn't fix the underlying injustice, that the official meals were still designed to break people down. Nutrition reports from the early 2000s showed alarming rates of malnourishment, iron deficiency, and rapid weight loss among inmates who couldn't afford commissary. And when riots did break out, like the infamous 2009 North Point Training Center riot in Kentucky, food complaints were always on the list of causes. Still, the inmate food culture endured. It became so widespread that researchers began studying it as a sociological phenomenon. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was a language of resistance. The act of cooking, sharing, and eating became a form of rebellion against the system's attempt to strip people of autonomy. Prison food blogs and YouTube channels began to emerge after former inmates were released. Videos titled, "How to Make Prison Pizza," "Prison Burrito Challenge," or "Commissary Cooking with Real Inmates" went viral, attracting millions of views. What began as desperation had become pop culture, a reflection of how deep the problem ran. But for those still inside, the reality remained grim. No matter how inventive they became, they were still forced to depend on a system that fed them like numbers, not people. The creativity of prison cooking couldn't erase the hunger, the monotony, or the psychological toll of eating the same tasteless food day after day, in a cell that never changed. And nowhere was that psychological impact more severe than in solitary confinement, where meals weren't just about nutrition or survival but about sanity. Because when you eat alone in silence long enough, even the sound of your own chewing can start to feel like company. In prisons like ADX Florence, where silence echoes louder than screams, food becomes more than sustenance, it becomes a mirror of the mind. Every bland meal, every tasteless bite, every lonely tray slid through a steel door chips away at something deeper than the body. It eats at the human spirit itself. Psychologists who have studied long-term incarceration describe prison food not just as a physical deprivation, but as a psychological weapon. When you strip food of flavor, texture, and warmth, when you take away the act of sharing it, you erode the very emotions that connect people to life. Inmates in solitary confinement often report that mealtime becomes both a blessing and a curse. It's the only event that breaks the monotony of 23-hour lockdown, yet it reminds them how isolated they are. The arrival of the tray signals time, breakfast, lunch, dinner, but not life. No conversation, no movement, no joy. Just the clatter of a metal slot and the scrape of a plastic spoon. For years, psychologists have documented the mental decline caused by eating alone. In ADX Florence, inmates have gone decades without ever eating beside another person. Dr. Craig Haney, a leading expert on prison psychology, once wrote, "Humans are social eaters. The denial of shared meals denies not just nourishment but identity, belonging, and hope. The lack of sensory stimulation, no aroma, no variety, no color, dulls the senses over time." Prisoners have described losing their sense of taste after years of processed food. Others say they stopped feeling hungry altogether. One former inmate told the Marshall Project, "After a while you don't eat because you're hungry. You eat because you have to remind yourself you're still alive." The connection between nutrition and mental health is well documented. Diets low in vitamins, minerals, and protein increase risks of depression, anxiety, and irritability. In prisons, where meals are often starch-heavy and nutrient-poor, that effect multiplies. Combined with solitary confinement, where isolation already damages brain function, the impact becomes devastating. Dr. Stuart Gracian, who studied hundreds of inmates in solitary, described symptoms nearly identical to trauma survivors: hallucinations, paranoia, panic attacks, and emotional breakdowns. He noted that poor diet worsened these symptoms, leading to malnutrition-driven insomnia and cognitive fog. Inmates often describe themselves as fading away. Even the act of punishment through food, like serving Nutriloaf, compounds the mental damage. It tells inmates that food, the one universal human need, is conditional. Eat what you're given or starve. Psychologists call this learned helplessness, a state where the mind stops resisting because it believes nothing will ever change. One ADX inmate once wrote in a rare letter, "They feed you enough to breathe but not enough to feel. That's how they win." In recent years, a few voices have tried to fight back. Human rights organizations like Amnesty International, the American Psychological Association, and the United Nations Human Rights Council have condemned the use of prolonged isolation and food deprivation. The UN's Mandela Rules, named after Nelson Mandela, who endured 27 years in prison, explicitly define solitary confinement beyond 15 days as cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Still, the United States remains one of the few democracies where inmates can legally be kept in solitary confinement for decades, and fed through a slot for life. The Bureau of Prisons continues to claim that ADX meals meet all federal nutritional guidelines. But as one retired ADX officer quietly admitted to The Guardian, meeting guidelines doesn't mean meeting humanity. In the end, the story of prison food is not just about what's on the tray. It's about what that tray represents: control, indifference, and the slow erasure of dignity. From the hearty meals of Alcatraz to the sterile portions of ADX Florence, the evolution of prison food mirrors the evolution of America's justice system itself, from correction to containment, from reform to retribution. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: every bite of unseasoned rice, every spoonful of powdered beans, every flavorless loaf is a reminder that punishment in America isn't just about bars and walls. It's about the quiet, everyday ways the system reminds people that mercy has an expiration date. From Alcatraz's hearty meals to ADX's tasteless trays, America's prison food tells a dark story of control and punishment. Food should never be a weapon. Subscribe, like, and share to expose more hidden truths behind the walls of the world's toughest prisons.